Just a little about my first poem. This is kind of what started my poetry journey. I wrote it in sophomore year and I won a competition with it. So I thought it'd be fitting, seeing as we're going to talk about my poetry journey today, to start with it. So it's called A Concerto of Spice. The subtle hint of spice, a symphony in the air, a crescendo of turmeric against mustard, sharp notes, the melodious harmony of cardamom and cinnamon wafting, a waltz. The passion and tang of citrus as fluid as a ballad's flute. Ginger as strong as the strum of a bass. The crisp presence of mint like the presence of my mother, the conductor of the ensemble. She taught me that the perfect hint of lemongrass orchestrates the soothing simplicity of balance. The heat of paprika strong as the heat of attraction. Tart zest of lemon as sharp as the power of speech. The crackle of dried peppers as loud as the laughter of my childhood. The smell mingles about now. I hear it, her presence dissolving in the wind, her frail hands stirring the pot, and her voice, commanding, soothing, echoing in the shadows of my mind, her voice calling me into a simpler life. I smell it, and in the silence, she dissolves into the air around me. Thank you.
Very nice. Thank you, Zoya Ahmed, and welcome to Sonoma Sounds. So there was a lot going on in that poem. There was family, there was food, there was music. Uh, was what was the inspiration behind it?
So going back to the competition I wrote it for, it was Poetry Ourselves in 2019. And I think the deadline was on a Friday. So I was just thinking like I was in the moment, right? Like I have to crunch before this deadline. Let me just submit something. And I grew up in a Pakistani and Indian household. So, we're really connected to the kitchen with like, all the matriarchs. It's like you learn through food, these life lessons. And also I don't know, I felt really connected to my mother at that point because I am not the strongest writer. I mean, I am a poet, but I never think of myself as like a writer.
Mhm.
Because, English was my third language. I still struggle through it. So I was thinking about what can I write about that I am truly an expert on? And that would be my family and my culture. So I thought the best I could write and my best ability in writing would be if I talked about that. So, I connected it. And also, ironically, during that day, in because I just came back from school, our band conductor was going through, our last concert, what we can improve, all these musical terms. So at that point, I was just like connecting art and connecting like in the moment what is happening, and my identity. So,
Mhm.
I kind of connected it. And at that time, I didn't know, poetic terms or structure or style. I was just writing what I did. But this year I took AP literature and my teacher was like, talk about, connecting different senses. Like you can hear taste or, you can play with sound.
Mhm.
Um, so I like realized I did that in my poem, but even now, even though I wrote it myself, I'm still learning about everything that it means.
Yeah.
Um,
So, what were your first two languages if English is your third?
so I grew up speaking Urdu and Hindi.
Okay.
For a person who knows Urdu and Hindi, they'll be like they're the same
Yeah.
language. Um, but Urdu is kind of a little more has more Persian roots and
Mhm.
Arabic roots, so it's a little more poetic. And Hindi has its own beauty, but the language, how it's written for those two languages, is completely different.
Mhm. Yeah. Can you write them as well?
I not a lot.
Yeah. So were you born in Sonoma County or?
No, I was born in Long Island, New York.
Oh wow.
So we moved here, I think, when I was in first grade.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was that experience like?
Oh, that was a big experience, a big
Yeah.
change. I was really young, so I don't associate like the move that much, but Long Island is a lot like Sonoma County in some ways, and it's really different than Sonoma County in some ways. I mean, growing up in Long Island, I lived in a joint family. So we were 26, brown people living in the same house for the longest time. It was all of my mom's extended family. And the whole neighborhood was just, very Caucasian. There wasn't a
Hmm.
single, like, I don't remember seeing a single person of color growing up. So when we went to school, it'd be like 10 kids going to school together with a very like not diverse population. So
Hmm.
I didn't realize it at the time, but that did have effect. I mean, the emphasis was really on assimilation, and that pressure didn't necessarily come from our parents, but ourselves as well. It's just
Hmm.
you don't realize what race is or what cultural assimilation is, but you're subconsciously going through it. But then in Sonoma County, I started learning these things. And the beautiful thing about Sonoma County is it's very diverse. Not as diverse as the cultural hubs like New York City or
Right.
San Francisco,
Uh-huh.
but it's still more diverse than Long Island and very very liberal.
Yeah.
um, so it was really nice seeing people from similar backgrounds, similar cultures, and not having the need to assimilate, but surrounding yourself with people that you could relate to. So, yeah.
Hmm. And did you start writing poetry or coming up with poetry, whether or not it was written, when you were in Long Island, or did that come more recently?
That came much more recently.
Okay.
Like I said, I wasn't exactly a writer, and
Uh-huh.
poetry itself is considered like when you think of English, it's like even people who know English, poetry is hard for them,
Right.
thinking back to college, thinking back to high school. So I didn't really attempt it. I mean, I grew up reading Dr. Seuss and like I knew rhyming,
Hmm.
but I never thought of myself like I could write poetry. But I think growing up here, like really maturing into a young adult and talking with my parents, I think that's the thing with immigrant children too. It's your parents kind of, there's a barrier, there's a cultural barrier, a locational barrier, a lot of generational gap. So it's not until you're much older that you kind of get these nuggets of information from your parents and you learn more about them. So when I started speaking to my dad, when I was older, he's talked about Urdu and like the poetic element of it, because
Hmm.
poetry is very prevalent in Pakistan and India. Great, great poets. And even in the independence of the countries, poets were involved. So we started talking about that, and I realized how big a role poetry played in my life, even if it wasn't English poetry.
Hmm.
So when I grew up to like see these opportunities in high school, like the poetry out loud competition, I realized that there's a balance. Like I have that unique perspective that I can have that balance of English poetry with my culture and like Pakistani poetry and all that.
Hmm. Well, how about another poem then?
Of course, of course. So my next poem, I wrote it recently actually for Earth Day reading. And I think it's really relevant. It's about the Middle East, and I think with everything going on, I think it's very relevant, but it's also on our relationship with nature. Um, so there'll be references in there, but it's called The Real Cost of Oil. One word dances on tongue, fail, oil. Dance with the words, her fingers, dance with the blood of mothers, dance through my scalp, through my dark bundles of knots, strands woven with this dance of oil. As if it were a passage of motherhood, every mother dances this dance, runs a sacred nectar through her daughter's hair, her two hands a crucible of liquid gold. Such piety. She dampens the fields, locks growing like maize, replenishing the roots, olive reeds growing out of my temples, coconut cream seeps into my mind like rainwater on a damp forest floor. Almonds soak, the smell of badam lingers like smoke. No matter the oil, the pride of millions of matriarchs perched on my head, a crown. But the pride turns to shame when the oil from another mother gets you called a foe. No, we were born over a pool of oil. Our dark skin ripened to match the gold. Those that called themselves the winners, conquerors, their calling, the cowards, called us the enemies in the name of the commodity. Those who kiss the sweet smelling red earth, blessed by their mother because she named them her protectors. But why is that those who are blessed are the ones who have to pray? Those who embrace their mothers are the ones that have to pay. Cowards kill their paradise for this charcoal like tar. And to create their suffocating concrete towers and to drive their malignant cars. For have you forgotten the paradise she gave you for free? Because how can we be so ignorant? For now there is no paradise to see. The fields are gone and one can hardly breathe. I'm sorry. We're the ones who failed you, mother, failed to protect you. But the oil in our hair dances with the oil our so called saviors want to reap. For those who don't know, this is the crisis of the Middle East.
Wow. So there's again a lot there, but more family imagery as well with mothers. And you mentioned earlier about um, I felt you implied that maybe your mom has a background in writing, um, and your dad in poetry.
Yes. My dad actually has a background in poetry. My mom not so much in writing. But I think my mom was more the contributor of teaching me our native language because she
Okay.
herself had, that she couldn't speak English. So I feel like I got more of my like language and like cultural education from my mom.
Hmm.
Um, but my dad was kind of this connector of, living here and living in, Pakistan.
Hmm. So, who would you say your biggest influences are as a poet?
Well, as you can see, you mentioned imagery of like mothers and family. And
Yeah.
yeah, I think when I think about poetry, I think my muse is my family and specifically the women in my family.
Hmm.
You know, as a brown woman, as a Muslim woman, there's a lot of times where there's images, stereotypes or assumptions of being oppressed or not having a voice. And a lot of the women in my family lived at home. They weren't, working women. They, cared for their children. Um, but I feel like there's a gap there because,
Hmm.
growing up here, it's very much career. You can do whatever you want.
Right.
Um, so when I think of it, I try to show the beauty of womanhood and the beauty of women who live there and, you know, dedicated so much to their households.
Hmm.
And these practices, which are really art, like in the poem, I connect it to, oiling your daughter's hair or your children's hair. And I think that's very a cultural thing. Like, hair has such respect and like you treat it with like, kindness. Um, and I think the women in my house were just very strong images.
Hmm.
They were the ones to, really fight for our family, coming here, living in America. In fact, my grandmother was the reason we're all here. Even though she didn't know about America that much and still doesn't know English, but I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of strength there. And
Yeah.
um, oftentimes women are overlooked. So I want to show that beauty in my poetry.
Cool.
Mhm.
And when you, since you've started writing poetry later in your life,
Mhm.
made you sound really old. You're not. um, More recently in your life,
Mhm.
you did you have any teachers that stand out to you as being people who were influential in awakening you to poetry or the craft of it?
Oh, 100%. I think especially in our culture too, teachers have like this very big role.
Hmm.
It's very much this like coming of age, guidance, mentors. And as a person who kind of struggled in the English classroom, struggled a lot in the English
Uh-huh.
classroom. Um, I think every English teacher that I've had really has brought me up to this point where I can write like this,
Hmm.
and given me confidence to write like this. But I think specifically in high school, it was kind of the turning point. I mean, I'm a speech kid, so
Hmm.
I love to perform, but
Hmm.
writing was where I had my weakness. So I
Hmm.
kind of compensated performing, for that writing's weakness, but I always tried. So specifically, I think shout outs Ms. Deacons, because she got me into the Poetry Out Loud competition. That kind of changed my world. And then Mr. Vanek this year for AP Literature. I mean, he's in Alaska now because he moved last year here. But I think that he taught me a lot about, the style and structure that goes into
Hmm.
poetry. I mean, I used to think that poetry was the one thing I could do because you can play around with style. Even if it's not like on purpose, you can like really play with it. And there's a lot of emotive value that comes from it. But he taught me that, how to use those style and that structure to tell a story.
Hmm.
I think that's really cultivated my poetry to be like this from what I
Hmm.
was writing 2 years before.
Yeah. And do you feel like your poetry fits within a certain school or tradition, or is it more individual to you?
I think poetry has always been, this reflection of my identity, like kind of like a
Hmm.
mirror. What I would be really thinking about, that's what I would write about. But
Hmm.
I think that also talks about what type of genre, what school of poetry it is in, because
Hmm.
being a first generation, a student, a first generation woman living in the United States, I'm kind of a mixture of everything. I
Hmm.
have my cultural roots, and then I have my American roots, and then there's also this very big love for pop culture and American culture that you can see in our generation.
Right.
So I think that all kind of bleeds onto the page.
Hmm.
Um, so I have a lot of like I'm really inspired by Rumi and Pakistani poets, but
Hmm.
then there's like I take from those themes, but then there's also a lot of elements of English poetry that go into structure and style. So it kind of just blends together into this new hybrid type of school, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let's hear another one.
Of course. So this next one is a bit shorter, um, but I think it talks a lot about, has a very powerful message. It's called Shoes. We should drink from our shoes, then maybe we wouldn't be so ignorant. We should first sip their souls, then maybe we wouldn't be so empty. Lastly, we should gulp down each other's stories, then maybe we wouldn't be so thirsty for each other's blood. Thank you.
It ties in a bit with your last poem as well, I think, with uh, some um, perhaps images of violence, but on a similar, less happy note, the past 2 years have been very difficult for many people, especially locally, fires and pandemic and all the protests about police brutality and racism last year. Have these things influenced your art in any way?
100%. When we think of my generation, we are coming across things that are so new. Almost, it's a big, big change, and it's hard because we're kind of specifically for me. I'm a senior, so I'm
Mhm.
graduating in 1 week, really, um, and this really big change that I'm seeing in my life personally, in my surroundings around me, and it's kind of this place of like reflecting back on what we have done, but then also being like, what do we have to change now? It's like it's not the point of just let's just observe what we did wrong. It's action. Like we have to take action, or things are never going to change. So I think that's climate change, the social protests, social movements. Everything is kind of affecting my poetry right now because one thing my dad said to me is like, a lot of kids don't have the position you have right now. Make use of it. So
Mhm.
I've never thought of poetry as just, let me just write this down, my feelings. I always think of it as a platform because a lot of people don't get these opportunities to, have their voice be listened to. And coming from that background of immigrant parents, it's a lot of like at one point my parents were scared. They didn't want me to say a lot because it's this place of respect, but there's also this place of fear. And so you don't get that voice. But being a first generation, I feel like I have the audacity to, demand that I need to be listened to. My voice needs to be
Mhm.
respected, and talk for people who don't have a voice. So, yeah, shoes specifically was really about this place of empathy. And, this analogy, I guess, I heard when I was a kid, we should wear each other's shoes, walk in each other's shoes for one day. And I think that that's where it came from, that, shoes also have souls. And it's kind of this like just merge of ideas. But yeah, specifically with so many movements going on right now, so many injustices, and growing up as a kid in right now, or as a young adult right now, um, there's this balance between performative action and this balance between actually doing something. And I feel like, oh, it's really easy for us to be like, oh, this is a trend. Like, let's just get on this. Very hype right now. But these issues have been happening for a while.
Right.
And I think, especially in the Middle East, as a Muslim, I knew of whatever was happening, and we really couldn't say anything or do anything because we need legislation. That's a big point of action, or we need, big like people to talk about this. So it's not until now that social movements and people's human rights violations have really been put on the spot, because it's just that charged atmosphere. And I think that's the silver lining in the pandemic. It's we're stuck at home, and I think that's somehow amplified our attention to what's happening in our world and what we need to change. So I think, yes, speaking from that perspective as Gen Z, immigrant, being in the pandemic, a student, I think all these factors, yeah, really
Mhm.
play a big part.
So you see art as both catalyst and mirror.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Um, and do you consider your poetry an art, or do you consider it a craft? A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think it's an art in the aspect it's so beautiful, but I usually think that when I read poetry that other people produce, I'm always like, oh, this is art. Like, this is so beautiful. Like, oh, the structure, the style. When I think of my own poetry, self-confidence kind of goes down. It might be
Yeah.
just the teen in me that's like not gonna tell yet, but it's like this, like a lot of times I feel imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
as a kid, as English is not my first language. I'm like, is this really good? Like, I don't know what the hype is for. Um, but then I think that's when I think more of it as a craft, when I'm like feeling it, like even if it's not good, it has a message. So that's why
Mhm.
I always try to incorporate a message. But I'm like seeing the art in my poetry nowadays. I'm like learning to have that like self-confidence. But yeah, like you said, bit of column A, a bit of column B.
Yeah. Well, let's hear another.
Yeah, for sure. So a little bit on more of a positive note. This is Good Night and Speak Dreams. It's one of my older poems, but I think I'm transitioning from that point of, adolescence, and really like now I'm an adult. But it's nice to reflect back on my past. And I talked about Long Island. So this is a poem from just the feeling of being in Long Island. Good night and speak dreams. Anticipating footsteps, the grass whispers amongst itself, cushions the bare soles of feet. My toes gradually sinking into a pillow of darkness as they do in the pearl white sand of Long Island's shore. The wind hums, tiredly sulking, snoring through the yard, reaching the shadows of red cedars and maple trees, the branches twitching in their sleep, creaking, sleep talking to the leaves, the chilled silence obscure, oddly calming, eerily serene, until the stars shower down on me, fireflies, pouring out of the darkness, night lights, illuminating a comforting glow in the velvet sky, as reassuring as a voice softly murmuring, there is nothing to be afraid of, when there's only the calm of darkness and a hum of silence. Evenings in New York, 2008. Thank you.
That was beautiful. What do you what can you tell us about any projects that you might be working on or plans for the future?
So yeah, I've mentioned graduating, so I'm gonna be spending the next year. Um, but I think, there's this really big point of reevaluating my poetry because, and what I'm specifically what I'm gonna do in poetry, because um, for so long I've been blessed with this beautiful community of Sonoma County, and the poetry scene is just so comforting, so nice and beautiful, and the people are just so supporting. But going into this new area, I just don't know, what the poetry scene is going to be like. Um, and if there's going to be a different vibe, and I think urban areas usually it looks a little different.
Hmm.
Um, but at this point, I think as my term as youth poet laureate, youth poet laureate is ending. Um, I think it's more going to be focused on a bigger project than these like small readings. And I think I'm cultivating a collection, perhaps a
Hmm.
book, just about the experience of being a brown woman in the United States, and kind of reflecting on that, experience. And I think one of my biggest, inspirations in that has been, Rupi Kaur and just her beautiful, beautiful poetry.
Hmm.
Um, but I don't know, I feel like there's this point of like, will people read it? Or um, is my this unique kind of experience gonna be as relatable to people as I might think it is? But, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. And, I've got a couple of poems and I'm really excited to, just put them into something that I can show the world.
Hmm. How long does it take you to come up with a poem that you feel is finished?
Ah, a part of me is like, this never finishes. Um, but usually, it's really weird. I have a really unique process. I talk to my friends a lot, my family, and I'm always trying to get inspiration from articles or, like a line or analogy. So I write down these titles and I'll just write down a title. And usually I'll try to connect it with something a little mundane. And then I'll like try to bring it up into this like thematic thing. And I think it's very much like a big thematic essay into like a small piece of like poetry. So I usually write down a title. I've got a couple of titles. And when I get the time, or I'm just up at night thinking about something, I'll try to like write some lines of a verse or a verse of the poem related to those titles, those topics, and then usually to hash an actual poem down, I think it takes like 3 4 hours. um, and that's a lot of revisiting, writing it down,
Hmm.
changing it, copy and pasting, revisiting again, taking from other stuff, and then I have it for a little while. But every once in a while, I have this collection of poems and I just go through it. Like I read through it and I'm like, how do I change the structure? How do I change the style? How do I like, what do I think about this topic now? How can I make this better? I'm very much like a visual imagery type of person, feeling type of person. So the emotive qualities when I'm writing something down really quickly is definitely there. I think I go back and revisit it to change the style and structure to, even more emphasize or greatly emphasize the meaning and message behind the poem.
Hmm.
But yeah.
So you said you're looking forward to maybe getting a book published. Have you done any chapbooks or anything like that?
No, no, I haven't yet. So this will be my first project.
Okay.
And I actually got a contract when I became the Youth Poet Laureate of Sonoma County to have a publication. They were so nice in allowing me, full creative freedom, like creative liberties.
Hmm.
So like I can go the chapbook route
Uh-huh.
if it's a little smaller.
Yeah.
Um, but right now I think I definitely want this to be more of a book in the sense that, there's a lot of like this topic has a lot of poems and messages behind it. But let's see where it goes. Yeah.
Hmm. So as we wrap up,
Mhm.
is there anywhere that anyone can find your work right now?
Not right now. Not right now. I'm still like just more of like a reading type of person.
Hmm.
But I think I might like, I'm looking into maybe opening up a like social media or, website. But yeah, I'm like revisiting all this stuff right now. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Zoya Ahmed, for joining us, and we look forward to reading your book whenever it comes out.
Thank you.